about 200 attendees, and it takes a few minutes for everybody to load. So if you'll just be patient with us, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning, everyone, from Bethesda, Maryland. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We hope you are all doing well, and we're glad to be with you today virtually. As many of you know, every Thursday since March, we've been hosting a series of webinars on COVID-19 and trade, and we're delighted to invite many of you back again and to welcome our new viewers. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be continuing these weekly COVID-19 and trade discussions until the end of this period of physical distancing ends. And this coming Thursday, we'll be discussing the Defense Production Act and Buy America laws. And next week, we'll be discussing COVID-19 and food security. Over the next few weeks, WITA will be going back to providing some of our more traditional content still via Zoom, including an online event on USMCA implementation and turning back to look at trade and environmental issues. For today, if you have any trouble with your connection, you can always go to WITA's YouTube stream and watch the event live there. After the discussion with the Congressman, we'll try to get to some audience questions. If you're watching this on Zoom, you have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But with over 200 people on this webinar, we're unable to have all of you on live audio and video, but we will try to get to as many of the questions as we can. For today's event, we're delighted to partner with the American Leadership Initiative to host Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois. We won't get into a great deal of the Congressman's biography, which most of you should have received in an email from us this morning, but I'd like to welcome the Congressman to WITA virtually. Welcome, Congressman.
Ken, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Schneider will be joined by my old friend, Orit Frankel, the Executive Director of the American Leadership Initiative. For those of you who don't know ALI, they are leading the charge to strengthen and reform America's global alliances and institutions, and to promote American leadership on things like trade, climate change, and inclusive and sustainable growth, both at home and abroad. As mentioned, after the panelist discussion, we'll try to turn to questions. With that, Orit.
Thank you, Ken, and many thanks to you and Diego and WITA for your partnership on this event, partnering with ALI, and we are excited about having Congressman Schneider and his, thank you to his team. And we're gonna take this time to look into the future of American global leadership in the wake of COVID-19. I also just wanted to say, to learn more about the American Global Leadership Initiative, please go to our website, american-leadership.org. Congressman Schneider, I'm just going to, even though people got your bio, I'm just going to mention very quickly that this is your third term representing Illinois and I think the greater Chicago area. You serve on Ways and Means and Small Business, which really gives you an important view as to what's going on with America's economy and workers domestically and globally. Prior to joining Congress, the Congressman spent 20 years as a management consultant, helping small, medium, and large businesses navigate the domestic and global economy. So I think he comes at this really with a great perspective. So I'm going to turn now to ask some questions. We're in obviously a very, very unusual time. And this crisis has not always brought out the best in countries. And right now we have a situation where every country is very much looking out for itself, hoarding medical supplies, placing export restrictions, et cetera. What type of global cooperation would be useful at this point as we look to both stabilize the spread of the virus and restart the economy?
It's a great question. Let me take a step back and just kind of talk where we are, where I think we are in the phase of things. Essentially, I believe there's going to be three phases as we work our way through the pandemic. The emergency phase, the phase we're in now, is where we're trying to just get a handle of things, get ahead of the crisis itself. The stay-at-home orders, as we have in Illinois and across the country and around the world, are as much a function of trying to just give some space, some breathing room to our healthcare systems, to let them catch up, to give our policymakers some breathing space. This stage is starting to, hopefully we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I think the next phase is going to be a mitigation phase, where it could be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months or longer, really until we have a vaccine, learning to live with the virus within our countries. And how we address that's going to be critical. And I think international trade will have to have a piece of it. And then ultimately, the recovery phase, which, depending how long we live with this virus, could be a short. Everyone's hoping for that V-shaped drop and rebound, or it could be a very long and painful process. We need to be thinking around all of those. And how we look at our international relationships and trade relationships, obviously, is critically important to that. If I look back, the part of the reason we are where we are is a failure of preparedness, a lack of leadership, and the breakdown of our institutions, or diminishing of our institutions. So I think if we're saying, what do we need to restore, certainly leadership and U.S. leadership becomes increasingly important. We saw with the epidemic, the Ebola epidemic in 2014, where the United States was the convening power. We were the ones who sent U.S. forces into Africa, made great strides in accelerating testing and contact tracing and working with communities to address the epidemic. That's been absent. I think we need more of that. As you touched on, you see countries all fending for themselves. For better or worse, to the extent that there were export restrictions put on PPE, they mostly were temporary, but it still showed a crack in the system. I think we need to restore and rebuild our supply chains and understanding, not a move away from interconnectedness, but I think a move towards it, which I may be counter what everyone else is saying. But we need the redundancies of having factories, multiple factories in each country, but multiple countries able to produce different products and working together. We need the resiliency that if there is a breakdown, we can find other ways to do it. And we need the slack. And I think this is also going to be one of the big changes. The slack is going to move from the just-in-time systems that we have gotten very good at developing into large warehouses deployed around the world. But if it's everybody for their own, that system won't work as efficiently as if we can have everybody working together.
Thank you. Actually, it was interesting. There was an article in the Post today, a piece by King Abdullah of Jordan, and he talked about the need to, as opposed to deglobalize, which a lot of people are talking about, he talked about re-globalization, but in a way that focuses on cooperation rather than competition.
Right. I think you're gonna have, ultimately, we're gonna have more of that. We're dependent upon each other. I think the breakdown, and you can point to the trade war between the U.S. and China, that led us to a situation where it was much more difficult to get the cooperation we needed in trading, not just between the U.S. and China, but around the world. And I think the positions that the United States has taken over the last few years put us in a diminished position vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Europe, our allies in Europe. And everyone ended up fending for themselves. And as much as any place, the U.S. is paying a price.
Yeah, so speaking of China, I mean, they are obviously using this kind of vacuum in U.S. leadership to assert their own global leadership they're sending medical supplies to a lot of the developing world. They're sending some of their medical personnel, and there's been some issues with the products they've sent. They're also spreading a lot of false narrative about the U.S. and spreading COVID and things like that. How should we step up to lead? How do we debunk China's narrative? How do we move through this into a future relationship with China, and what does that look like?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. China is trying to make the most of this. They were on their back a bit at the beginning of the year, and they've recovered and gotten their footing, and trying to push their influence out. Again, to the United States role, I'll start here at home. We need to focus on making sure that the information we're sharing within our country is accurate. And they say truth is the first casualty of war. Well, in a pandemic, I think truth is also put at risk, and we need to make sure that we're getting honest assessments of where we are, what we still face, the steps we're making to address the pandemic, but also truth in our relationships with other countries as well, and that engagement, and the interdependency and interreliance between our countries. To the extent that the world looks to the United States and can rely on us to deliver on our promises, to stand up to our commitments, that's a crucial factor. I think that's a big question mark as China's pushing its agenda forward. China's got a lot of largesse. They are trying to share it around the world. They were doing that before this crisis. But as we've seen in places around the world, that largesse often comes with not just strings, but ironclad cables that make it very difficult for some of the countries to work with China. I think what many countries around the world have seen in their relationships with China, the interaction between expatriates working around the world from China versus the citizens in their respective countries has not always been great. So China's still going to struggle to push its influence around. The United States still brings a lot of capacity. The big challenge for us here at home, and I say this as a policymaker, as a representative in Congress, we need to make sure that as leaders, we are more important at this time than almost any time. We are using our bully pulpit to lead and not to follow, because there's going to be the instinct to let's just bring everything home, do everything at home, and we don't need the rest of the world. This is a global pandemic. The challenge is global. The solution will be global. The world has always looked to the United States. We need to make sure that continues.
Thank you. So, obviously there's a lot of talk. I mean, given the shortage that we've had of PPE equipment, ventilators, other medical equipment, there's been a lot of talk of onshoring manufacturing, perhaps expanding the definition of, what is security, what types of products we need to manufacture in the US. And I think other countries are having those discussions as well. How do we, on the one hand, address those legitimate concerns, but make sure that trade remains open, and how do we deal with those impulses yet maintain an open trading system?
No, that's a great question. And again, I think it's keeping a broad perspective. So you're not just looking at the narrow interests of your own country. If we have to manufacture everything here ourselves, store everything here ourselves, it's going to cost us a lot more. And odds are we're not going to have exactly what we need when we need it. Again, crises emerge around the world. It's not often we have a global pandemic like we have now. But if we had the global relationships, in fact, as we get our footing and you start seeing us make progress, it's because of our global relationships, we'll do a better job. So we have to lead on the conversation. You will see more capacity building here in the United States, and I think that makes sense. We need to have that, but we can't be, the idea that we can do it all ourselves, I think, is pure folly. So engaging with other nations, focusing on the ideas of comparative advantage of nations, different places will be able to provide an abundance of different pieces of the full puzzle or the total solution. And if we work there, if we rebuild our institutions, again, it's going to take U.S. engagement in those institutions. We shouldn't be pulling out of the WHO. We should be using our weight to try to reinforce and improve the WHO. Those types of things are the leadership we need, but it's going to have to come literally starting at the top with the president. And I don't know that this president can do it. I'm hopeful the next one can.
So, you know, I think the crisis is obvious, you know, as you noted, has exposed, you know, some cracks in our global institutions. You know, the cracks were there before, you know, they've now just become, I think, more apparent. You know, many of our institutions need to be reformed, upgraded. Maybe we need new institutions. So how do we change, adapt our institutions to our post-pandemic future?
So I always often like to say that I'm an engineer, not a historian. So I look at things very logically, but I don't have the same understanding of history as someone who spent their life studying it. But I do study it a little bit. And if you look at the history post-World War II, the institutions that we take for granted today, the ideas of the Marshall Plan as an obvious way to address the challenges of that time weren't so clear-cut. I think as we look at where we are going to be post-crisis, and I've said this quite a bit, we'll be talking about the post-COVID economy, I believe, the same way that for the last 70 years, 75 years, we talked about the post-World War II economy. It's going to be that dramatic of a change. But there are a lot of differences between the two periods. At the end of World War II, the United States was the sole surviving superpower. The Soviet Union was emerging, and that defined much of the period. Today, it's an entirely different global economy. This pandemic is a threat to individuals and our health and our society, but the factories and facilities that drove the economy will be standing and ready to begin running once we get through this. So it's going to be a much different period. The institutions that didn't exist 75 years ago are in place today. As you said, they need reform, they need modification, but I think we have much more to build with. So as we look at where we will be, whether it's 6 months or 18 months from today, and where we hope to go, I think the lessons from the past, the importance of alliances and strong relationships between countries, the interconnectedness of peoples, which is even more so, just the simple fact that we're having this conversation with hundreds of people dialed in wasn't possible even a decade ago. That interconnectedness is still going to be there. That gives us both the challenge and the opportunity. Focus on the opportunity. How do we bring people together? How do we develop the institutions that can be prepared? As I said at the very beginning, this was a lack of preparedness put us here. How can we make sure that we are uniting people, developing systems that can address solutions in a timely manner, and again, stepping up to the efforts of nations and non-state actors? We're going to try to undermine that with whether it is social manipulation of social media and societal interconnectedness, or other actions that have a different set of objectives.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have really thought about how different this quarantine experience would have been 25 years ago, before the internet and social media. You know, I think really the existence of Zoom and other platforms has made this whole experience, I think, more tolerable on a work, social, and personal level.
Absolutely. It's allowed us to conduct, just looking at the way the Congress has been working for the last several weeks, we're able to conduct our business, whether it's via Zoom or having conference calls. We're not fully operational, and I think there's more that we could be doing with the technology, but that's also true for law firms and schools. There are a lot to learn, and it hasn't been an easy transition. I have many friends with young kids. The teaching from home and doing your job from home is difficult, but I can't imagine what this would have been like even 20 years ago without the capacities we have today.
Absolutely. So going back to the discussion of the interconnectedness of the world and alliances, you know, I think over the past few years, there have been increasing fissures between the US and the EU, and increasing fissures within the EU, as exemplified by Brexit. We've had an administration that has not really shored up the EU or NATO. And personally, I think that's something that we really need to work hard to restore. How can we restore our support for the EU and our relationship with Europe during and post the pandemic?
No, absolutely. And again, looking at the 75 years since World War II, the EU evolved over time. It took the European countries to come to the conclusion that their interests were better served united than they were independently. And then of recent years, there's been many questions culminating with Brexit, obviously. The coronavirus pandemic is without question a existential threat to the EU. You've seen different countries responding in different ways. And the United States has an important choice to make. Do we exacerbate those fissures and weaken the EU, or do we, as I think it would be the right approach, recognize that it's in our interest to have a united Europe, to have a strong ally in the European Union, that the differences between the countries that make up Europe are far outweighed by the benefits of a united Europe. And the support for NATO, commitment to NATO plays a role in that. The United States standing firm in our commitment, in the dedication to Article 5, you can run through the whole system. The engagement with all of our European allies as equals in the battle against COVID, but learning from each other. Germany's had a much better outcome in their approach than certainly what Spain and Italy have suffered through. But together they can help each other, learn from each other, and lift each other up. The recovery will be shorter, I believe, that third phase, if there is a strong Europe quickly getting onto its feet and restoring manufacturing and the trade with the rest of the world. Recovery will be shorter if the United States can get quickly on its feet, if China can get its factories up and running and working. And we all depend on each other. If those aren't back up and running, then the economic impact of this crisis, we talked so much about the health, but the economic impact, we're already looking at something very much akin and likely worse than the Great Recession. We don't want to end up with something like the Great Depression of 80 years ago.
Yeah. So I know that one of the things that you've talked about is, and we've seen this over the years, that there's been a real lack of support, decreasing support among the American public for American global involvement. And the trade, aid, et cetera. And I think, during the pandemic, that's only increased. I think, more and more Americans feel like our resources and focus needs to be directed inward. How do we explain to the American public the importance of maintaining, restoring American leadership, maintaining open trade, and how vital that is to our economy and the national security? And how do you talk to your constituents about that, particularly today in this environment?
Sure. I mean, I always start with appreciating where whoever's asking the question or whoever I'm talking to, where they're coming from. A lot of people that feel that they have not benefited from the growth in global trade over the last generation, whether they or someone they know have lost their job, whatever the situation might be, they feel that they've been left behind. And I think that's a real sincere feeling, and we have to be honest about that. I believe that our economy has grown because of our interconnectedness with the world, but that growth has been uneven, and we got to work to address that. The ability, as I was saying a moment ago, the ability for us to enhance the slope of the recovery is, I think, very much dependent on our ability to invent things here, make these things here, and ship them around the world, but that interconnectedness between the countries. So to talk about why trade's important, why our relationships with our trading partners is so important, but why, as a country, we need to do a better job of ensuring that the economic growth that international trade brings to the United States is enjoyed by not just a few, but distributed across the country and raising all boats, if you will. So that's the broad conversation. But I think we also need to work to show specifics of why we benefit, the innovation that is driven here, the value-added jobs that are created here, the ability to ensure that our kids are going to have the promise of a better future that our parents and grandparents sacrificed to give us. We've seen it in polling for a long time. So many people don't believe that, and we've got to restore that belief. And it's going to be difficult coming out of this crisis to get people's confidence. So staying on message, working together, trying to show that our institutions work. We talked about our international institutions that bring the alliances. We can talk about the international institutions that govern trade and ensure that we have fair trade across the world. But we need to make sure that our institutions here at home are working as well. That's Congress and our federal government in general. It's our state governments. It's our education system, healthcare system. The sense that, and I've been saying this day in and day out from my home work, from working at home, that we need to believe that our best days still lie ahead of us. And so I'll keep on that message, but within that message is they lie ahead of us because we're part of a world and we're going to work to improve the world in general.
That's great, and very much aligned with ALI's mission, which is really to restore American global leadership, but in a way that is inclusive and sustainable. And shows people how they can benefit from it, from that leadership.
Absolutely.
So on that note, I think I'm going to turn back to Ken. I see that we have a few questions already. So let's open it up and let people ask the Congressman some questions.
Thank you, Ori. Thank you, Congressman Schneider. Really appreciate your remarks, and I take it as very hopeful to hear your thoughts on this and your continued interest in the international agenda and the global agenda and work that the interconnectedness, I think is a word already used. So an interesting question one of the first ones I'm going to read is from an old friend of many of ours, Brian Pomper, former Chief Trade Counsel in the Senate Finance Committee. Brian asks about Congress's evolving views about China. Certainly, the president came into office with very strong views in his cabinet, and people like Peter Navarro clearly had strong views about U.S.-China relations. What evolution have you seen amongst your colleagues in Congress about the views about China, both trade and geopolitically? And then, of course, now we have layered in both the real information that we have about COVID coming out of China, and then a lot of chatter behind the scenes about things that maybe we can't see very well there about the origins of all this. I guess so the question back is, how have the views of your colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, evolved in the last 3 years?
Yeah, great question. I think we've seen a divergence of views between Democrats and Republicans evolving over the last couple of years. Part of that is the positions of the president, which vacillate between positive and negative towards China. I have a real concern that the rhetoric coming out of not just Congress, politicians in general, and communities lacks a certain nuance vis-a-vis China. It's easy to set China up as the boogeyman. China is a challenging trading partner, a geopolitical adversary, a competitor militarily. We need to be very clear-eyed as we look at China. We need to understand that they have their own agenda, but understand that what drives them is a series of priorities and concerns that may not align with our priorities and concerns. So it's important that we understand where we're coming from as well. We have interests we have interests around the world, obviously. Too many of the conversations I've been involved in the last 3 years certainly have oftentimes not necessarily addressed what our global interests are. There's been this retrenchment from engaging with the rest of the world. I personally think that's wrong. I think the world's a better place when America leans in. The United States is leading. The need to lead on trade is a perfect example. I would much rather have a trade regime that is not necessarily perfect, but led by the United States, than a trade regime that would be so much further from perfect, led by China. And there is a sense of many of my colleagues that we can pull back and do everything ourselves. We don't need the rest of the world. I think there's going to be pressures for that sense to grow within the body of the Congress. There is, and I'm part of what's called the New Democratic Coalition. This is a group of pro-growth Democrats who feel much more strongly that we need to be involved with the rest of the world, and that while we have to always keep American interests first and foremost, we can best serve our interests by focusing on engaging with the rest of the world and exercising the leadership that the United States has done effectively in the past, representing both our interests and our values.
Thank you. And in fact,
I'll just
goes,
add
there's
in,
another question that popped. Sorry, go ahead, Ori.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think keeping up a relationship with the pandemic is going to make the relationship with China even more fraught, as people kind of come out of what they see as the Wuhan virus or the misinformation from China.
Yeah, let me just add, we need, like I said, we need to recognize China for the bad actor they are when they are behaving badly, and that is often. We need to recognize what their priorities and their objectives are. But we also at the same time, we need to be very cognizant of the xenophobia and racism, bigotry that's rising in our country against Chinese Americans, Americans of Asian descent, and stand up to that as strongly as we stand up to China's bad behaviors.
Thank you. And in fact, I think you pretty much answered another question that came in, which was about China's influence in global institutions to the extent that the United States is stepping back in any leadership of both the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization. It creates a leadership vacuum that other countries may fill. In some cases, it may be the EU at the World Trade Organization, but in the WHO, I think there's a concern about that the Chinese may be exerting a greater influence, especially if the US pulls back there. So we have a couple of other questions, Congressman, that have come in that are pretty trade specific, but maybe come to some of the things that you addressed when you're on the Ways and Means Committee. And one of them has to do with a lot of interests have been asking for tariff deferral during this time. We're giving a lot of economic aid to businesses, small businesses. Hopefully individuals are getting their checks and their deposit in their accounts at some point soon. But are you seeing that as any pressure building in Congress to provide some sort of tariff relief from some of the tariffs that have been imposed in recent years, or delay or deferral of those duties while we're in this crisis?
I think there has been, and you saw the administration, not quite in the dark of night, but very quietly waive some of the tariffs on the medical products, PPE, understanding that maybe they're not having the intended outcomes that the administration was desiring. We need, keep falling back on the idea, we need smart trade policy. We need to punish those who are abusing the system, but we need to work to make sure that there are markets for our products, that our companies, as others like to say, when the playing field is level, U.S. companies not only can compete, they will frequently and more often win, because we are a country with a great sense of entrepreneurship, an incredible ability to innovate, and ability to manufacture at the highest levels. We need to continue to do that and make sure there are markets for our companies. But to do that, we need a trade regime that allows not just product, but the pieces, parts, and assemblies that make up those products to flow in the supply chains across borders as smoothly as possible.
And I think, Congressman, that segues really nicely into another question that came in, which is, do you see the United States reinvesting in some of the mechanisms for trade? Certainly there's our financial institutions like Exim Bank and OPIC that have been a little bit, there's been some pressure on in recent years, but also even things like the Jones Act and development of our ports. There's a concern that when trade starts reopening up and supply chain has been so disrupted, there'll be a lot of bottlenecks at ports. And I'm just curious if that's been anything that you've been hearing about from constituents, or if it's gotten any discussion among your colleagues in Congress.
So as we've gone through the last several weeks, almost all I've heard about is directly related to the immediate emergency, the keeping my business open, PPP, et cetera. I think as we move to mitigation and certainly recovery, the other issues are going to become incredibly more important. The Export-Import Bank is an example. I was my first term in Congress began in 2013, and we had the fight over the Export-Import Bank at that point, which, to be honest, I understood the fight. I didn't understand necessarily where people lined up in the fight. It didn't make sense to me. Where people were falling. It was more local politics or whatever the reason. We fought hard to get funding for the bank. It took a lot of persuasion for many of my colleagues to understand that it is in our interest to have that support for trade, that if we don't, there are 60 other nations who have that support. I think if you look forward, the need to move into the recovery, we'll be very grateful that we have a strong and robust Export-Import Bank to help American companies compete. The issue of the courts, there hasn't been much discussion yet, but I think as we get to that next phase and we understand how do we help product move, how do we enhance our ability to be prepared for the next pandemic, all of that's going to put a spotlight on those issues. And I certainly expect that we'll have those conversations within the Congress.
So I want to remind folks to please use the Q&A function to ask any questions you may have for the Congressman. We have one that's gotten a lot of attention, another one that's got a lot of attention in the trade community since COVID, and it's a direct COVID impact, which is implementation of USMCA, the new NAFTA. There's a real hard push to get it to enter into force as soon as June 1st. A lot of companies before COVID were scrambling to adjust to the new rules, to readjust their supply chains to meet some of the new rules of origin requirements, minimum wage requirements, which were an incredibly novel concept that was put into this trade bill. But now with COVID and so many people out of work and so many companies unable to fully function, those timelines are still being held for fast implementation. Have you heard of any plans, or is there any discussion to try to ask the administration to delay implementation while companies struggle to get back on their feet?
Not yet, but even when we passed USMCA, and that was a extended process to get to the place we needed to be. Before we had the final vote last year, there was already extensive conversation of implementation is going to be just as important as getting to the negotiated agreement, and making sure that we implement it in the right way, giving companies the time to do what they have to do, but keeping the heat on the fire so they do it in a timely manner, is going to take leadership from the administration. We haven't had those discussions up to now, but if I'm looking for evidence of cause for concern, if you look at the implementation of the PPP and some of the other things we're seeing come out of the administration, it hasn't been that effective. And I don't mean that to beat up the administration at this point. I want to learn from the lessons. I want to make sure that we're learning our lessons quickly to implement the programs we have in place for the crisis. But let's also learn to elevate competence and capabilities within government to implement some of these other programs, and USMCA is a perfect example. If the government can partner with industry to make sure that the trade agreement is implemented effectively, the benefits that are anticipated will be realized that much more quickly. And if we are giving conflicting guidance, if the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, then many of those benefits are the risk of being lost. So
interesting. the question that just popped up, which actually goes to one I was thinking of a little bit, although it's not one, not directly, but if you could, if the Speaker's office is listening to this call, I don't know if they are or not, what recommendation would you make for how to function as a Congress going forward in this time? Committee hearings, oversight hearings, getting testimony from administration officials, voting. You're a little bit more technically proficient than some of the others, but you've seen how some of the technologies have been working the past few weeks. Do you have any recommendations that you would make?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to make sure that our government is working and as effectively as possible, as securely as possible. And those are the trade-offs, is what can we do to make sure we have the security necessary. But I do believe we can use the technologies to conduct operations, starting with hearings. The benefit of hearings is to bring witnesses forward, to let them provide testimony. I spend actually more time in preparing for a hearing than I do sitting in the hearing. That research and work is beneficial for me to understand an issue. We need to do that. The other benefit of hearings, or important function of hearings, is oversight. And we see with, go back to the Paycheck Protection Program, the need for oversight. We are literally spending as a nation trillions of dollars that it's being spent in the most effective, efficient, and transparent way is a role. And then the third piece of hearings and markets, the committee work, is developing solutions and testing them in the, I don't want to call it the laboratory, but the crucible of that hearing process, with members bringing amendments coming from both sides, Republicans and Democrats, coming up with making whatever was the starting point a little bit better and a little bit more focused, I think would all be effective. And then having formal debates from the floor. I think we can do that with technology. We're supposed to go back next week on the 4th. The House and Senate are coming back. If we can do that in person, that's obviously a much better way than doing it remotely. But we need to protect the safety and security, not just of Congress and the work that we do, but the members of Congress. Many of the members of the House, and even more so of the Senate, are in that age group that is at the highest risk. If we have someone get sick, or God forbid, pass from this disease, that disenfranchises the people from that state or district and the representative. So we owe it to each other, not just to keep ourselves healthy and safe, but to keep the representation of the entire country intact. So technology, I think, is a way. We'll have more discussions next week when we are in DC. Actually, we had a call yesterday in the Democratic caucus. We'll have another call later this week. There'll be more discussions. I'm sure the Republican conference is having their discussions as well. But what I'd really like to see is us coming together, Republicans and Democrats, not in a partisan way, saying, let's stand up this Congress. Our city councils are working. I've got company boards that are having their quarterly meetings. The United States Congress should, again, lead for the rest of the world. Other nations are starting to do it. Let's figure out how to do it, whether it needs to be in person, keeping us safe, or remotely keeping us safe, but keeping our government functioning.
I'm going to ask one more question, Ori, and then ask you guys both if you have any final remarks. It's an interesting question. You were talking about Congress leading, and this comes from our friend Mary Latimer at Mars. She's asking about the leadership from the states. We've seen it certainly from governors in the crisis itself, the health crisis. A lot of different governors have stepped up, both parties around the country. But on these trade issues that we've been discussing and America's global leadership, of course, a lot of states and cities have sister cities and partnerships around the world. How can they be taking part in helping build some of these alliances going forward, not just from the federal level, but from a state level? And is it a two-way street? Do those leaders of groups like the World Trade Organization and the OECD and the WHO, do they need to be visiting the states more than just going capital to capital and explaining why what they do has a global impact and a US impact?
No, I think to start in the middle of the question, absolutely going to visit the states more is really important. And I'll use my experience in Chicago, Illinois, and the US as a starting point. Chicago is an international city. We have, I think, more than 65 consul general offices here, in consular offices in Chicago. Illinois is obviously a significant participant in global trade, in particular around agriculture. It's critical for the survival and growth of our state. And if we're going to tackle the many challenges we have in Illinois, we need to be engaged, not just in the US economy, but a global economy. That's really important. But putting a face on that and having delegations from our trade partners coming into Chicago and Illinois, dealing with our state government and our local governments, I think plays a very important role in understanding, why does this matter to me? If I am working a farm in central Illinois, why do I care what's happening in the European Union or China or Africa for that matter? And I think you've seen over the years, because we have such a strong international presence in Chicago and thereby Illinois, a much broader appreciation of that. So I think the more we can have those connections, the better. But there's another piece to it. I think we've seen it in this crisis. We've seen it with climate change. We've seen it in a number of ways. Where there have been failures of executive leadership within the executive branch at the federal government, you have seen governors, business leaders step into the void. You've seen mayors step into the void. And if I look at what's happening with the rollout of the roll into the mitigation phase on the pandemic, you saw the governor step in where the federal government was falling short. Each one was tweaking a little way. They followed each other and developed their own process. When governors are going out on extreme, and I believe what's happening in Georgia is probably too early at this point, but other states are going to watch that very closely and learn from those states. But you have conflicts between the governors and now the mayors. That's why I picked Georgia to start. The mayor of Atlanta is taking a very different position than the governor of Georgia. We will all learn from that, because a city like Atlanta may have more in common with a city like Chicago, but rural towns, agricultural towns that are remote are entirely different than Chicago. So our approaches have to be customized to the circumstances, the local circumstances, understanding that we are integrated not just within the state, but across the country. Our borders are porous. I want to keep them porous, that we can move around the country freely, but that as a nation, we can tackle this. And that I think our governors and mayors are going to have an important role, and our business leaders are going to have an important role in that. But we can't replace the need for leadership at the federal level. We need the president to step forward and bring the nation together, unite us, and help us dealing with supply chain. I've been calling for a supply chain czar who understands where our immediate needs, how can we work within the country and across the world to get what we need and deliver it where it's going to have the biggest effect.
Thank you. Thank you. Ori, any final words?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you to the Congressman,
Well, thank you.
and his team, and Ken and your team. I think I agree with Ken in that I think this was hopeful. And I think, hopefully the pandemic, crisis, as equals opportunity, and that we will come out of this really with the ability to rethink what our global engagement ought to look like with fresh eyes, and hopefully a renewed sense of purpose that we need to be engaged globally, but in ways that work for farmers, small businessmen, manufacturing around the US. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Congressman Schneider, for joining us. Thank you, Ori, and the Alliance, the American Leadership Alliance, for partnering with us on this event. We're very grateful to all of you. Everybody, please take care, be safe, and we look forward to engaging with you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.